it okay if I share my screen? I have a few slides. Okay. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So thank you all so much. It's really exciting to be here talking a little bit about populism and multilateralism today. And thanks to the ECPS team for the invitation and organizing. This is really a great group of speakers and papers and talks. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the motivation for me of studying populism. I grew up in Northeast Ohio in the US. Youngstown is the city specifically, which is in the heart of the Rust Belt, was a major steel producer. And so I grew up experiencing a lot of this backlash to globalization that sort of sparked resurgent populism in the West, especially backlash to trade. And so I became really interested in how individuals latch on to populist ideology at a fairly young age. And then when I began graduate training, I became interested in international organizations as well. And so this has been a neat way for me to sort of bring together two topics that I'm really fascinated by and interested in populism and international organizations. So what I'll talk to you a little bit about today is based on a book chapter I'm preparing for the Oxford Handbook on the International Monetary Fund, which has to do with regime complexity. So the sort of lots of donors that exist now in the international finance space and how populists are confronting this governance complexity. So to start, I'll just outline the question I'm trying to answer with this research, and then one takeaway that you should keep in mind if you remember nothing else from this talk. So the question is, does populism really spell the death knell for international organizations? And I think this is really what a lot of us are interested in today, right? Are populists sort of lashing out at these organizations in a way that may cripple them or prevent them from making progress toward their mandates moving forward? More specifically, I'm going to think a little bit about how populists navigate governance complexity. So do they try to take advantage of the fact that there are multiple forums that govern a given issue space? The takeaway is that I don't think it's likely that populists will exit organizations or sort of abandon them completely, but rather they'll remain engaged in these organizations in ways that play to their advantages. So they can leverage aspects like regime complexity to avoid the policies that they find to be intrusive or stringent. So we often call this forum shopping. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a few slides, or regime shifting. And essentially what this means is that populists are going to select the forums that give them the best deal, right? The least intrusive policy package, the one that erodes sovereignty the least. And this enables them to sort of appeal to their base as they engage with international organizations. So as we all know, populism is on the rise. This plot I have here covers the period 1989 to 2017. And it's based on a meta-analysis of over 700 academic articles in political science, economics, sociology, and history. And so basically, you can see that the blue squares become more common as we move to the right side of the plot. That's why we're here today, right? Is to think a little bit about the rise of populism and how it intersects with international cooperation. It's also the case, we know that populists often oppose IOs. I won't linger too much here because we've had some nice overviews from the first two speakers on this topic. But populists generally try to pit the pure people against some corrupt elite. And that elite can be domestic, right? It can be business people, or it can be international. And the pure people we typically think of as the common man in these countries. And so that can be working class individuals, folks that maybe are relatively less wealthy. Sometimes we think of the middle class in the United States as being a part of this pure people. They're folks that feel like they've been left behind, especially by emerging trends like globalization, international trade, and economic interconnectedness. And so international organizations have become a popular scapegoat for populist leaders. They identify IOs as highly technocratic institutions that employ experts, right? And these experts, these highly educated individuals, are sort of a perfect scapegoat if you're thinking about the way that populists frame the corrupt elite, especially because these are international elites. We also know that sovereignty concerns are really important to populist leaders, right? They don't want international organizations to infringe on their ability to select the policies that best benefit the pure people, right? Or these constituents that they care a lot about. So it's the case that international organizations are a good target for populists. And this is true whether populists are right or left-wing in ideology. So this literature that I'm citing here talks about how IOs are often framed as incompatible with populist ideology. Left-wing populists we often think of as redistributionists, right? They want to redistribute wealth from the sort of wealthy, rich elites in a country or in the global economy back to the common man. And so redistributionists can oppose international organizations because they think that they benefit primarily the wealthy internationally. On the right-wing side, we have nativists, right? Folks that look for international or foreign outgroups that they oppose. And so this is, again, a case where international organizations are a good target because they're sort of an ideal type elite foreign outgroup. And so the idea is that international organizations are benefiting foreigners more than they're benefiting those in the country that the populist is governing. So these are sort of common cues that we see populist leaders using. But what I'm going to argue here is that populists can actually leverage what I call regime complexity, and what the literature talks about as regime complexity. And so a less technical way to describe this is regime complexity is governance by multiple international bodies with overlapping mandates. And so just an example, in the development space, right, the World Bank post-Bretton Woods was the only game in town. It was the only multilateral forum where you could get concessional financing for things like infrastructure projects. Today, there are 28 international organizations that operate in that space, and they overlap significantly, right? So some countries, for instance, sub-Saharan African countries, are members of as many as a dozen of these multilateral development forums. And so what this means is that countries can forum shop, right? They can choose the forum that they believe gives them best deal, or shift their operations from one regime to another in order to try to minimize adjustment costs. And so in much of my research, I think about conditionality, right? The policy requirements that are attached to foreign aid, whether emergency loans from IOs like the IMF or development-oriented finance from institutions like the World Bank or bilateral donors like the US, Europe, and China. These requirements can be on spending, right? It can tell you how you can spend the money to try and prevent corruption. They can also be on governance features such as democracy and human rights. Those are the conditions that we often think of as particularly intrusive for state sovereignty. They really minimize a country's freedom in terms of the leader's ability to implement the policies that they may want to implement in order to retain power. And so autocratic regimes, populist regimes, or a combination of the two are often extremely hesitant to take on aid with these conditions. Prior to a more complex world that we're in today, they didn't have many options, right? They couldn't select the least costly forum among some menu of financiers. And today now they're able to leverage this and sort of select the forum that minimizes these adjustment costs. I also have work showing that countries can generate bargaining leverage by threatening to shop in this way. So focusing on the International Monetary Fund, I show that countries that belong to regional financing arrangements, so these are smaller IMF-like institutions. The Latin American Reserve Fund is one. The Eurasian Fund for Stabilization and Development is another. We can also think about the European Stability Mechanism, some of these European monetary institutions as regional financing arrangements. China has sponsored two of these institutions, the Chiang Mai Initiative and the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, which is a BRICS institution. In each of these cases, access to some of these forums enables a country to go to the IMF and credibly threaten to substitute away, right? To be able to subset some amount of the money that they would otherwise take from the IMF. And in doing so, they can bargain down fewer of these conditions that threaten sovereignty. And so I think there are strong theoretical reasons to believe that populists should be especially likely to do this. Right? They should really want to avoid these adjustment costs that erode sovereignty. They should want to distance themselves from international organizations rather than negotiate with them in these ways, because negotiations on loan programs in particular is where I focus most of my research. These are highly public negotiations, right? They can incite protests, as we've seen in countries like Argentina, Sri Lanka, Tunisia in recent years. And so avoiding these relationship costs, especially given the rhetorical benefits that populists can realize by scapegoating these organizations or targeting them as sort of outgroup elite institutions, I would just expect them to try to leverage institutions that they can sell as having given them the best deal, or the one that gave them the most flexibility over policymaking in their country. I'm going to focus the rest of my talk on the International Monetary Fund, as I sort of foreshadowed. The IMF is sort of an ideal type institution for populists to lash out at or target. because it's a highly technocratic, highly bureaucratic and expert institution. Most of the staff have advanced degrees in economics and in a very liberal ideology form of economics, right? Neoliberal ideology, trying to advance core tenets of the liberal international order that the US and Europe tend to advance, things like economic liberalization, privatization, right? Minimizing the size of the public sector, fiscal austerity, and trying to eliminate things like tax loopholes that are often prevalent in the countries that suffer from balance of payments crises. As I highlighted previously, the IMF imposes extremely stringent conditions on countries under loan programs. They will mandate that state-owned enterprises be privatized, that wages be cut in that sector. In the short term, you expect unemployment to go up. You expect the currency to devalue, things that cause short-term adjustment costs that can be politically really consequential and even cost leaders, populist or not, their jobs in democratic countries. The IMF also deploys bureaucrats to conduct routine surveillance, and this has become politicized in some populist countries as well, including Hungary, because when IMF officials land in a country, the media will cover it. And it's the case that countries will try to distance themselves from these bureaucrats that are perceived to be snooping around the economy and then making policy recommendations. And so I've done a little bit of work on the surveillance side as well. At the IMF, just an example for you is Viktor Orban, who said prominently, we sent the muzzle back to Brussels and the leash back to the IMF, highlighting here in rhetoric during campaign speeches that it's really important to distance yourself from these international organizations as sort of a populist leader. So what I'll show you here is a little bit of evidence that populists are trying to distance themselves from the IMF, and then I'll show you some additional empirics that show specifically that they're able to generate leverage to try and reduce some of this conditionality. So here I have a plot that just shows you the probability of a country showing up in an IMF program in the post-1990 period. Non-populist countries have about a 10% chance of entering an IMF program, all else equal, in a given year. Populist country is closer to 7%, so that difference is statistically significant. And then I have some advanced empirics in the book chapter that I won't show today just for simplicity and time, that show that controlling for all sorts of economic factors that otherwise would cause countries to enter into IMF programs, populists are especially likely to avoid these programs when they have outside options. So when they belong to institutions like the regional financing arrangements that I discussed previously, right? These institutions that can offer emergency financing without strings attached. I also have evidence showing that when countries receive more loans from China, they're less likely to enter these IMF programs. And just over the last few weeks, there have been a number of articles in the New York Times, Financial Times, and elsewhere highlighting how China is now coming, sort of emerging as an IMF competitor, right? Offering emergency financing and bailouts on the scale of IMF programs that is allowing some of their client states that have become tightly connected to them through BRI to actually avoid IMF financing and the conditions that come with it. And then here, this comes from a regression with a bunch of controls, the dependent variable being the number of conditions that appear in IMF programs. And populist leaders, I find, are actually able to bargain fewer conditions. And so the effect here is it's pretty close to a 20% reduction in the number of conditions that you receive in a program if you move from a non-populist to a populist leader within a given country. So these models have country fixed effects, year fixed effects, as well as a cohort of economic, political, and geopolitical control variables. And so what this tells us is that all else equal, populist leaders appear to be able to derive some leverage from their position as anti-elite, as anti-IO, right? They can credibly threaten to shop away from institutions like the IMF, these big global institutions that have very strict policy goals and try to impose conditions or policy requirements on these countries. So populists can credibly threaten to exit, especially when they have these outside options, China, regional financing arrangements. And so while they're going to remain engaged with the International Monetary Fund, right, they're not leaving the institution per se. They still have representatives that meet behind the scenes in board meetings. They're casting votes. They're paying their dues, right? They're sort of being good citizens, you could argue, of these institutions. They can utilize a combination of rhetorical bashing, right, of the institution to try and sell to constituents that they're distancing themselves from these organizations, as well as close bargaining and forum shopping to minimize the adjustment costs of participation in ways that allow them to sell their participation to the public. So just to wrap up here, and then I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments, populists engage with international organizations despite hostile rhetoric to the contrary. but they leverage regime complexity to minimize the costs of doing so. And so there are material costs, right? These include the adjustment costs that come from economic reforms, for instance, at the IMF that are attached to loans. So reducing conditions is one way to reduce material costs and short-term costs. But they're also trying to minimize audience costs, or an inconsistency between this rhetorical bashing of international organizations and the practical engagement that they undertake with these organizations. So by trying to sell the fact that they got a good deal, or by shopping away to these less stringent forums, they can minimize inconsistency between words and deeds and sell that to the public as such. I argue that this limits the ability of international organizations to promote reforms and accomplish their mandates. And so there are negative knock-on effects for these organizations, right? If it's the case that countries are shopping away or threatening to do so, and they're able to limit the number of conditions that institutions like the IMF can impose on their country, then populists can sort of undermine these organizations over the long run and prevent them from accomplishing their mandates of liberalization, whether political or economic. But I'm also going to argue that this is preferable to populists exiting or ceasing cooperation with international organizations, right? A widespread revolt, given the number of populist leaders that exist in the world today, would be incredibly detrimental to the liberal international order. And by keeping superficial engagement in place, especially if populists then come out of office, right, and non-populists take power, it's pretty easy to repair these relationships, as we've seen, for instance, with moving from the Trump to Biden administration in the US. So there's a way to preserve the legitimacy and vitality of these institutions, or the collective acceptance of these institutions in ways that are reparable after populists leave office. I think I'll leave it there, and I really look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Richard. So I would like to open to the floor if you have questions to Richard's presentation. You can either write on the chat or raise your virtual hand and I give you the floor.
So I see one in the chat that I'm happy
to... we do have one in the chat. So go ahead, Richard, you can answer that one.
Sure, I'll read it out so that others can make sure they hear it. So the question is, how do you see the influence of the 2008 crisis on rising populist backlash in the US and Latin America, as well as Europe? And then can I compare it to other economic crises to understand patterns? So I think this is a really good question. And the 2008 crisis certainly had a massive impact on the rise of populism, both in the West and in the global South. So I'm thinking about like the Greek crisis, right, as a really clear case where you have the IMF enter, the rise of Syriza, right? The problem in that case is that Greece had no outside options. And so this talk today was really about what happens when countries have leverage, right? Or they can derive leverage from an availability of multiple donors. In the Greek case, they were members of the EU, right, which could lend to them, and they were members of the IMF. But because the EU and IMF cooperated on the bailout, there was nowhere for them to go, nowhere for them to threaten to leave other than to exit the Eurozone and risk default. So that was a case where stringent conditions were enforced somewhat easily, but that caused a populist backlash. And so in a lot of these countries that have negative prior experiences with the IMF or with economic crises in a globalized world, you do see a lot of populist backlash as well as a resistance to re-engage with the IMF. And you can go back to the Asian financial crisis and see this as well. The institutions, regional financing arrangements that China is a member of, Chiang Mai, and the contingent reserve arrangement partially came out of the reticence of Asian countries to re-engage with the IMF after the Asian financial crisis in the 90s. So this isn't the first time that we've seen sort of anti-IMF sentiment, but I think it is among the first time we've seen sort of anti-IMF sentiment closely tied to populism outside of Latin America, where we've seen waves of this in Argentina, Venezuela, and elsewhere.
Thank you, Richard. If there's nothing, no other question coming from the audience right now, I would actually have a question for you, because I think it's super interesting that you put forward this this argument that populists can benefit from IOs. I think we can kind of see this happen in the case of the European Union with Hungary, especially. I mean, for them, is not for Orban, is not actually interesting to leave the European Union anymore, but actually to use what he can in terms of bargaining and veto and blackmailing and so on to get what he needs to stay in power. But my question is more in the sense of do you see also nuances and different types of populists engaging with IOs and kind of being part of this model that you propose? Because I was also thinking of some populists in Latin America, for example, that because, I think it requires also from populists to have a minimum structured and functioning party organization, network, party alliances, like qualified people around them to be able to influence those processes at the level of international organizations, especially these that are quite technical, as you mentioned. So, and I think this is not always the case, especially in Latin America, I would think, where populism is very much linked to specific personalities who are, and these leaders are not always relying on strong organizations like party organizations or big networks, political capital, and so on. So would you see this kind of differences operating according to different types of populists?
This is a great question. And so I'm actually working on a book project with Alison Carnegie at Columbia on populism and global governance more generally. So we have a theoretical concept that I think gets at some of this. We think of populists in sort of two ideal types. So one are these very charismatic leaders that you mentioned that may be detached from a party ecosystem, that are sort of true populists, right? They truly are anti-elite. They believe that the country should be governed by the pure people, like in a true sort of direct democracy sense. And so they disengage from international organizations on ideological grounds, right? And so in those cases, you would expect them to really try hard not to engage with the International Monetary Fund, not to take on these programs, to look for all other available alternatives. And I think in Latin America, you see a lot of this. In Europe, these would be some of the parties maybe that are more flash in the pan, right? The ones that rise to power and then sink back to, single-digit vote shares in the next parliamentary cycle, which we've seen in Greece and elsewhere. The alternative is what we could call like instrumental or pseudo-populists. And so those are going to be individuals who are tied to existing party infrastructure, who sort of try to claim populist ideology because they're performing or because they think they can gain vote share from doing so. But they're not sort of ideologically opposed to engaging with these organizations to realize benefits from cooperation, right? Such as economic aid. So in that case, I think there's more room for some of this engagement, like what you see Orban doing, and then rhetorical, trying to sell how they're engaging in ways that benefit people. And so I think drawing that distinction helps to get at some of these tensions that you're interested in. Ibrahim actually sent me a question separately.
Okay, go ahead, because we also have a question on the chat. Can you see it?
Do you have time to ask you a very short question, Clark?
Yeah, I can take it.
You mentioned that by ignoring or undermining the effective functioning of international organizations, populist leaders are also undermining current multilateral order. In that regard, can we say that intentionally or unintentionally, directly or indirectly, they are also helping current authoritarian big powers to take the lead within the context of current power transition?
Yeah, so I think that's definitely possible, especially if we're thinking about these Western international organizations that previously would have conditioned aid, or even bilateral donors like the US and EU, conditioned aid on democracy, right? On institutional strength and reforms that are meant to improve democracy. Sometimes you also see aid conditioned on like the presence of election monitors. And so to the extent that some of these democracy conditions fall away in the aid space, it's certainly the case that authoritarians could utilize some of this space that opens up as a result and use that to grab power. So I think this is a legitimate concern and something that we should think more about.
Thank you, Richard. We have time for one more question that we see on the chat. So it's from Booland. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. My question is, whether do you see any direct relations with populism, populist actors, and corruption? Do you think that because of that reason, they shy away from working with the IMF?
So one interesting thing about populism, at least the way I define it, is that it's thin-centered, right? It's compatible with all sorts of ideologies, and it's compatible with democratic or authoritarian values. So there are certainly like quasi-authoritarian populists that engage in high levels of corruption. And I mean, there are examples of this that are abundant. There are democratically elected populists. We could think of Bolsonaro or Trump that then become corrupt once they enter office, right? Or that have corrupt ideas and ideals. But inherently, populism need not be corrupt, right? So I think in some of these cases, certainly corruption, a desire to engage in corruption leads these leaders to avoid the IMF. It's also the case, though, that these leaders, if they have options, right, as I highlighted, they might be able to bargain down some of these transparency conditions that come with IMF or Western aid. And if they can do that, then they might be able to still engage in corruption as well as benefiting from these international organizations. So I think it sort of depends on the specific context you're looking at, but yes, this is a valid concern, certainly. And also I wanted to thank you all for the time and the questions. This was a fascinating discussion, and I look forward to participating in some of the other sessions later tomorrow.